following program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts.
About money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
It's Friday afternoon, and we're talking about money. Want to thank Mike and Julia, who filled in for me last week. I was at a conference, a very interesting conference called The Money Show down in Las Vegas. I usually do that every year. It's very fascinating. Almost all the presenters, in fact, all the presenters are newsletter writers, and it gives me some indication of what they're thinking about the markets and about things that are going. And I want to talk about some of their insights or some of the things which I found interesting. One thing that happens is at lunch, you have a panel. And I have to say this because it's the only question that I asked during the entire time. I think the only question that was really fascinating that I asked, I have to say. On the panel, it became very, very negative. And a lot of the conference was very negative, and I'll explain why that was going on. But during the panel, it was a very negative time. And one of the panelists, who I mentioned before, Hillary Kramer, got up or was saying, as people were talking, how things were so bad in the United States. She said 93 million people are unemployed. 93 million adults are unemployed in the U.S. It was too much. I couldn't hold. I had to raise my hand. I had to ask the question. I said, did you really say 93 million people are unemployed? Yes. I said, that's half the adult population. That's a 50% unemployment rate. I have to say, it was pretty unusual. But those are the kind of things which, from a conference like this, people would begin to quote. And most of these people, most of these panelists, most of these presenters go from conference to conference to conference, and they feed off one another. And I could see that kind of a comment being made by somebody else again and again and again. So I just had to ask the question. It's not really 93 million people are unemployed. That is such an exaggeration. But anyway, the conference was an interesting conference. One of the things that was pointed out, which I hadn't thought about very much, is the type of stock market that we're in. It's very unusual, and a lot of unusual things have been happening this year and at the end of last year. Unusual kind of market. It's a market where almost 25% of active fund managers have beaten the market this year. 25%. That's unusual. The last few years, almost no active fund managers were beating the market. It's also unusual when you reach a new high that you don't have some panic covering going on by the short sellers. We haven't seen that. As the Dow, as the Standard & Poor's reaches new highs, we're not seeing the short covering we normally see. That's very, very strange. People that have been around many years find that very strange. So what's happening? The first thing that's happening was pointed out, Mark Hurlbut, Hurlbert, I'll get it right one of these times. He records and follows all the newsletter writers and then compiles what they have to say. He pointed out in a presentation what Adam Smith, back in the 1960s, Adam Smith, he wrote The Money Game, took off a pseudonym under the pseudonym of Adam Smith. The original Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, but this author took the pseudonym Adam Smith, wrote The Money Game. And he pointed out in the 1960s, the kids market. And I believe we really are today in a kids market. Now, if you look at mutual funds, half of the stocks from the exchanges and NASDAQ are owned by mutual funds. Over half, maybe it's closer to 60%, are in mutual funds. So it's a big chunk of what's going on. And if you look at who the mutual fund managers are, over half, are less than 30 years old. Half of them are in their 20s. They were in college at the time we went through the Great Recession, or some were in high school. They didn't experience that as money managers. It's something, my parents and my grandparents went through the Great Depression, and they described some of the things that were going on. And we read about the Great Depression, and there's books that have been written about the Great Depression. During that whole period of time, when I was licensed from the 1980s, 90s through 2000s, up until we hit the Great Recession, I knew about the Great Depression. I knew a lot of what was going on. But until you experience that firsthand, until you feel that, until you see people losing their jobs, until you see people being foreclosed out of their homes which they thought they were buying it at the right price. They wanted just to own a home and build their equity in the home. They lose their jobs, not just from a regular layoff, but masses of people. When you see 10% or 11% of people unemployed and looking for a job, people that really wanted to find a job and not being able to find a job. When you see people who reach retirement age and can't afford to retire because their portfolios have dropped 30% or 40% or 25% and know that they don't have enough money to retire, they're going to have to continue to work. When you see people who at 62 are looking at Social Security, having lost their job or being close to out of work, when they know that the best thing to do is to wait until they're 70 to collect Social Security, but they're in such a bind that at 62, as soon as they're eligible, they take Social Security? Until you've lived through that whole process, you don't understand. As a small business owner, you wonder, am I going to be in business a year from now? Is it going to impact me? You look around and you see the number of businesses that are failing, not because they're bad businesses, but because the economy has dropped off. When you look at car dealers and you look at the car companies that are closing down, car dealers that have been in business for 10 or 15 or 20 years, but they're just simply closing them down, that's something that just sets you on edge. And if you've lived through that, it's a very different feeling than if you're just reading about it or hearing about it. If you're reading about it and hearing about it, it's something that's academic, but there's not an emotional connected to it. If you look at it, Adam Smith said it was like, and I'm trying to find the exact quote, and I can't find the quote. Of course I can't find the quote. Of course, I was on my way. Smith created a fictional character he called the Great Winfield, who exploited kids' markets by only hiring investment managers who were not 30 years of age. And the quote is, "The strength of my kids is that they're too young to remember anything bad. They're too young to remember anything bad, and they're making so much money they feel invincible. Now you know, and I know, that one day the orchestra will stop playing and the wind will rattle through the broken window panes, and the anticipation of the freezes the rest of us who are old enough to remember." That's what Adam Smith wrote, and that's what the fear was as we talked and the newsletters wrote their newsletters, because they've been through this. They went through the crazy bear market of 2007, 8, and 9. The kids, they've not gone through this. They have simply read about it. They've heard about it. They were in college. But it was not a personal experience. We've gone through a period of time when there has not been a correction. And normally every 2 years or so, you get a correction in the stock market. We haven't seen one for 4 years. So you have newsletter writers and you have old experienced managers who are sitting and waiting for a correction to happen, and it doesn't happen. And they take steps that are kind of defensive because they're waiting for this correction which hasn't happened. They're waiting. And yet the kids know no fear. They're out there, they're charging forward, and their time will come. Their time will come. But for now, they're enjoying it and things are going well. That's where we stand with the kids market. That's what it is. Now, setting that aside, I also have been through bear markets. I've been through the dot-coms. I've been through those difficult times. And I believe underlying this whole thing is a very long secular bull market that we're in. Not a couple of years, not 4 years, not 5 years, not 10 years. It could be as long as 15 years. But there will be a correction, and there will be several corrections. And it will take the wind out of the sails, and it will break the windows. But right now, we live in this kids market. Don't go away, because I want to come back and talk about the positive of this whole thing too. I'll be back right after this commercial break. Don't go away. We got more to say.
About Money will resume in a moment with Mike Adams on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Lots of people manage investment portfolios. Just a few can manage a successful portfolio and provide exceedingly great service to their clients. Here's Mike Adams from Adams Financial Concepts.
We believe the price you pay should be based on the performance of your portfolio and the quality of service you receive.
Mike, it seems that a lot of companies subscribe to the one-size-fits-all mentality of investing. Does one size really fit all?
Not with us. Every portfolio that we manage is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. We place our client's interests first in all portfolio decisions.
If you're looking for a home for your 7-figure plus investment portfolio, call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts, specializing in creating and maintaining wealth for over 20 years. 206-903-1019. That's 206-903-1019. Or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Now we return to About Money. There's more information waiting for you at adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here again is your host, Mike Adams.
So I started the program talking about this conference and talking about the kids market, a market where it's young money managers that are running the mutual funds. Now, mutual funds have, as I mentioned before, over 50% of the stocks are owned by mutual funds. And now over half the mutual fund managers are under 30 years of age. And when I went to this conference, there was a very negative feeling over the whole thing. There's been negative feelings, in fact, since 2007 or 2008. It's been a really negative time to go. People have been negative. Some have predicted that we're going to go to 1,000 on the Dow. I don't believe any of that. I don't believe that we've got a 2008 scenario coming, although some of those people believe that. In the second half of the program, my second dialogue, I'm going to talk about why I don't believe that's true. But, underlying this, there is this period of time. There's not been a correction in the market for 4 years, and usually there's a correction every 2 years or so. And with these young people, it's been a very different kind of market that we've experienced over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's almost like a dichotomy of managers. You have those who are very young, and you have those who have lived through the dot-com bust. They've lived through the Great Recession. And as Adam Smith said, memory can get in the way of such a jolly market. I mean, the market has been very, very good. And I believe there's some reasons to believe that it's going to continue to be good. I've talked any number of times about the super cycle. Standard Chartered Bank did a study, and it goes back a number of years. But they talked about periods of time in history when the market has, or the economies have actually grown faster than the average. And those are long periods of time. The first super cycle from 1874 to 1913 was driven by the industrialization of the U.S. We went through a financial crisis in 1874 that changed this country. We moved from an agricultural nation to an industrial type nation. But it was a very difficult time as well. We don't keep track of the numbers, but we probably had 20% unemployment, as bad as the Great Depression. We didn't have a government step in. It was a very difficult time, but the U.S. became an industrialized nation, and it wasn't just in the U.S. because we drove that for the rest of the world, and that was an economy worldwide that grew more rapidly than average. The next supercycle period was from 1945 to 1970, driven primarily by the industrialization of, not the industrialization, but the rebuilding of Europe. But it was also a time we saw that the European colonies became independent. We saw in the U.S. the building of the infrastructure, the freeway system, the airports, all those things going on. It was a time in which world GDP grew at a more rapid rate, 1945 to 1970. And what Standard Chartered Bank said is beginning in 2009, we're entering a new supercycle, and I believe that's true. It's a time in which the emerging nations are going to drive an economy, a world economy, at a more rapid rate than average. And when you think about it, the forecast is that 93% of the world's middle class will live in these emerging nations. If you look now, China has a bigger middle class than the entire population of the U.S., and India is almost there. Those countries, that were identified as the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, they're growing, but they're not the only countries that are growing. So many more are growing. And so underlying this whole period of time, we have what's probably a very strong secular bull market, maybe the best bull market of our lifetime. That's how impressive this could be. That's what we could be into. And if you look, any number of times I've made the comparison between 1982 and where we stood in 2005. There's a very big parallel between those periods of time. We were concerned about entitlements. Social Security was going broke in 1982. We were concerned about U.S. debt and the trade deficit, for that matter, the two debts. We were concerned about inflation. We were concerned about GDP, which was really slow and stagnant, just like it's been in the last few years. We were concerned about high oil prices, and we're concerned about that before. Now oil prices have come down. We were concerned about the government and the use of government fiscal policy back in the early 1980s. We were concerned because companies were showing not very great profits. All those concerns, very similar to what we were seeing today in this last 5 years. But that was a period of time in which we saw a tremendous move in the stock market. We saw a tremendous bull market, one of the greatest bull markets that we've ever seen. And I believe that we could be, with a supercycle, headed for that as well. I don't believe that we're coming to a 2008, 2009, and I'm going to talk about that after our guest. But first, I want to shift gears. We have a guest, a very interesting guest who has a lot to say. Adam Phillip, Aon Law Group. Welcome to the program, Adam.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So, Adam, why don't we get your background? I think it's a fascinating background, by the way.
So, I was born in Hawaii. It's Aloha Shirt Friday at Aon Law today. That's why I'm dressed for radio. And growing up, my family moved all over the world. We had a bit of a bohemian lifestyle. So Italy, Spain, Switzerland, France, Israel, Iowa, and eventually ended up in California and then moved out to Seattle.
So Italy, Spain, Israel, Iowa.
Yeah.
Somehow all that doesn't fit together.
So
But anyway,
only child of a single mom who decided to travel the world and explore and find herself, and I was along for the ride.
fantastic. So you finished the travel.
So I finished the travel for, well, I still enjoy traveling, but now I have a home base, which is out of Seattle.
So why don't we talk about after you came back to the U.S.?
So right now I have a law group called Aon Law. We focus on high-tech intellectual property law, which means patents, trademarks, and copyrights predominantly, protecting companies' great new ideas.
And before you got involved with Aon, before you formed it, you were working for a large firm too.
Right. So right after I had finished my graduate work in computer science, I actually joined the world's largest law firm, Baker McKenzie. After that, I worked in-house with a technology startup in San Diego called Anonymizer. And then the dot-com crash hit, and they couldn't afford to have an in-house attorney at that time. So I moved up to Seattle and then joined an intellectual property boutique up here called Christensen O'Connor Johnson Kindness. Great firm, but I had it in me to build up my own portfolio of clients. And so in 2004, I started my own firm and have been going with that ever since.
So your firm has a very different approach.
We do. So we started out with the conventional approach, sort of the normal attorney, time and materials, billable hour type of experience. But clients and attorneys agree that the billable hour sucks. It's just not something that spreads a lot of joy. And I was thinking a lot about why I wasn't enjoying the practice of law as much as I could, and why my attorneys weren't thriving, and why my clients resented me spending time with them when I was just trying to help them. And I came up with this model where if I could only figure out exactly what projects cost, then I could get around charging by the hour. And then I could also start optimizing for efficiency as well. So in 2009, I formed a new business concept of how to set up a law firm. And with this business model, we have a menu of services. So if a client needs something done, if they need a patent, they just go to the menu. There's a price associated with that. And one of the I had to figure out that there were actually 3 sets of interests that I had to align. And previously, they'd all been misaligned. It's the law firm, the attorneys, and the client. And the attorneys want to get paid, and the law firm wants to provide high-quality work and have a good reputation. And the clients want things better, faster, and cheaper. Mm-hmm. Well, you've all heard that you can better, faster, or cheaper, pick 2. Well, I wanted better than 2. So I went with better, faster, and predictable, which is we refer to as 2.5.
Okay.
And the way the model works is that we ask for our clients to tell us that they're ready to begin a project by putting the money in our escrow account or attorney-client trust account. And once we receive that money, then we know to begin the project. And we only earn that money when we deliver that directly to the client. My attorneys know that they're going to get paid because the money's available, and the clients know that their project is never going to go over budget since it's a fixed fee. And we've been thriving under that model ever since. Productivity has more than doubled. Our clients are happier, we're happier. And the other thing it does is it rewards attorneys for getting better at their jobs. I mean, if they can figure out a more efficient, more intelligent way of doing things, they get rewarded because they don't have to spend as much time on doing the same types of projects.
We're going to come back and talk about all these concepts in more detail right after the commercial break, because we've just covered the very brief overview, but I think we want to drill down and talk about this because I think it's a fascinating concept. Don't go away. We're going to be right back after the break, and we've got stuff to talk about. Don't go away.
More about money coming up with Mike Adams on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Creating and maintaining wealth has been the specialty of Adams Financial Concepts for over 20 years. Every portfolio managed by Adams Financial Concepts is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. The client's interest always comes first in portfolio decisions. Call Mike Adams today at 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com to check out their AFC performance. They welcome your review. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
We're back with more about money. For details on what you hear on today's show, visit adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Now, here again is Mike Adams.
So I'm here with Adam Phillip, the CEO and founder of Aon Group. We started to talk about his firm, and why don't we first of all describe what your firm does?
So we protect people's intellectual property, so patents, trademarks, copyrights.
And you do it on a fixed fee.
We do.
So how do you do it on a fixed fee?
So we're the experts, and we actually know what it takes to get a trademark filed or to get a patent filed or to argue with the patent office as to why something should be protectable or not. And it used to be that clients would just rely on, how much time it took us to do this. But over the years, I've figured out how much time it takes to get any one of these things done. And since my clients are relying on me to be the expert, I figured, all right, if I can estimate plus or minus 10% what this project should take, why don't I just offer them, that middle ground as a fixed fee? I mean, there's no need to hide the ball anymore with them. Just tell the clients exactly what it will cost.
And so, but you have not just one price for everybody. You have several different categories. So why don't you explain the categories?
Oh, so we just have, instead of, again, making a very complicated process where nobody knows what the final number is going to be, when we get a project, we can tell if it's going to be low complexity, standard complexity, or a high complexity project. And frankly, the vast majority of our projects fall right in that middle ground of a standard complexity project, so 80% plus. And so we'll usually use that as a starting ground whenever we're talking with a client. But if we find out maybe we're going to be doing a bunch of similar projects, and so that first one will be standard complexity, but we've already done some of the heavy lifting, the later projects will then do at a low complexity level.
But you have categories as well.
Well, what do you mean by categories?
I mean, when we talked offline, you were talking about 4 different.
Oh, okay. So if you're going to do, for example, a patent application, there are 2 kinds of patent applications that you can file in the U.S. There's a non-provisional, which is what most people think of, that gets examined and eventually turns into a patent. And there's a provisional, which is a placeholder application. But of the non-provisional, there's a new category of non-provisional. It's called the Track 1 prioritized patent application. And the Patent Office treats those like VIP patent applications, and they'll examine them extremely quickly. Quickly for them means 1 year. And so because everything happens within 1 year and we can easily scope what that process is going to look like, we offer a complete start-to-finish price, flat fee, $25,000, covers that whole process, all the attorney work that's involved in that. And then the only thing in addition is whatever the government fees are, and we just pass those along at cost. With the standard non-provisional, we charge a flat fee that covers the initial filing phase, everything that's predictable in that phase. There are no surprises. And we don't charge another fee until there's another business decision, once we receive feedback from the patent office and they give us some additional information. We can go back to the client and say, if you want to proceed, here's what the next step will cost. And again, give them a flat fee that helps them. So they can, It's so they can make a good business decision. You can't make a good business decision unless you actually know what the cost is.
Right.
And it's like telling somebody that you're going to have a paper cut and it's going to bleed, but we're not going to tell you how long it's going to bleed for.
So what about the company that's beginning and they're really new?
So for the newer clients, provisional patent applications are a great option. So we have a fee for an attorney-drafted provisional patent application, and we actually also have something that we call a coached provisional patent application. So at the other end of the spectrum, not $25,000 for attorney's fees, but only $2,900, we can actually coach a client in through drafting their own provisional patent application. We act like the navigators and keep them on track. If they didn't have us along with them, coaching them through the process, it's easy to get off track and create the wrong kind of document that would be something that would protect their intellectual property. So we coach them through that, and we treat it like a homework assignment. They submit it back to us, we'll review it until they get it correct, and then we file it on their behalf. So we like working with large companies and small companies, and the reason why we have that coach process is for those people that are just starting out so that they can still preserve that, and it buys them a year to then get in either revenue or investment that they can then use to continue on with the process.
So you mentioned at the beginning, I want to come back to the 2.5 things. The 3 things are?
Can get better, faster, or cheaper. Pick 2.
Pick 2. Okay. So you want to do 2.5. So you want to do it faster?
We want to do it faster. We want to do it better. And instead of cheaper, and sometimes even better than cheaper, is predictable. Because our clients are often working with fixed budgets, and they need to figure out how they can use those budgets to get the type of protection that they need. And if you're not giving them a fixed price, they need to leave some kind of amorphous additional amount that they're not sure if it's going to be used or not. And they may not end up using their full budget, and then they might lose it the next year. Working with us, they're able to put all the puzzle pieces together and maximize that full budget that they have.
So somebody comes to you, they want to do a project, they say this, you quote them a price, they get going, and then as this whole thing rolls out, they find there's differences or whatever, there's revisions that need to be made?
So we offer unlimited revisions for free.
Ah, okay.
So one of the concerns that people have if you're getting something done faster is quality.
That's correct.
And so we don't want our clients ever worrying about quality. And so we offer unlimited revisions for free. But as a slight twist, I like to make sure that everyone's incentives are aligned. So our attorneys don't get paid for the revisions. So it's in their interest to give our clients the highest quality draft the first time around. Again, this doesn't disappoint our clients because they're quite happy to get a nice high quality draft the first time without having to do a lot of changes on it.
That's, that really makes sense. And it makes sense for you. And the attorneys, when do they get paid?
They get paid as soon as they deliver a draft to the client. So the client signals us to start the project by putting the money into trust. At that point, our attorneys know that the money's there, so they're not worried about getting paid. But the sooner they want to get paid, the sooner they'll deliver something to the client. And again, they want to deliver the highest quality version first.
So they're incented to get it done quickly, and they're incented to make it a high quality at the same time.
And of course, naturally, it follows that it's predictable.
Yes. It's a great story. It's a great concept.
Well, it just clicked with me a few years ago when I was trying to figure out how can I reduce my accounts receivable, since it was just something that I wasn't paying attention to. I was busy being a lawyer. I wasn't thinking about my business. And frankly, my accounts receivable had ballooned beyond a convenient level. And I was thinking, how can I reduce the number of days that are in that accounts receivable? And then I had sort of an audacious thought. What if I get that down to 0? How could I get my clients to pay me before I even do the work? And I was like, oh, they would never do that. Clients hate evergreen retainers that just need to be replenished all the time. It's like, well, the reason they hate that is because it seems like an unreasonable use of the money. But if if the money that I asked for in advance was exactly what was going to be used, well, that's not unreasonable to ask for.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I found out that there is no point in the business relationship where a client is more willing to pay the full amount of a project than at that moment when they agree to do the project. So I figured if I can only just capture that one moment.
It's a great concept. So if people want to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
Aeon Law, aeonlaw.com. And we're happy to offer a free half-hour consultation to get people's questions asked. One of the most esoteric areas of the law is intellectual property law. Most lawyers don't handle that. In fact, to be a patent attorney, you're required to have an engineering or hard science background in addition to being a lawyer, and there's a separate bar exam that you have to pass. So we handle those very technical areas, both on the technology side and on the legal side, that most people don't cover. We like to think of ourselves as the Switzerland of law firms in Seattle. We handle the very, very precision instruments and the very rare materials that people entrust us with.
I wanted to ask one more thing before we finish, and that's international patents, because you get a U.S. patent, but in today's world, in globalization and what's going on, you may get it patented here. How do you assure that you're not going to have somebody copy it overseas?
So luckily, there are two treaties that the U.S. is part of. One gives you a grace period of 1 year from when you file a U.S. patent application to then file internationally. And that dovetails nicely with a second one, the Patent Cooperation Treaty, that lets you file a single application in the U.S. Patent Office that goes to the World Intellectual Property Organization that gives you patent pending status in 140 plus countries around the world. And that buys you up to 30 months from your original U.S. filing date to decide if you want protection. Now, international protection can be very expensive because you actually need to hire lawyers in each one of the countries or regions that you're going to seek patent protection in. But if there's a market there that's important to you that you want to protect, either because of it's a source where you manufacture goods or it's a source where you sell your goods or services, then it can be a very cost-effective way of providing a business tool to the people in that country to then protect your assets.
That's fascinating. It's a great story, great company, and you have an incredible business model. Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much.
We're coming to another commercial break. Don't go away, because I want to come back and talk about why we're not going to see a 2008, 2009 again for a while. Don't go away. I'll be right back.
Stay tuned. About Money returns in a moment with your host, Mike Adams, here on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Lots of people manage investment portfolios. Just a few can manage a successful portfolio and provide exceedingly great service to their clients. Here's Mike Adams from Adams Financial Concepts.
We believe the price you pay should be based on the performance of your portfolio and the quality of service you receive.
You know, Mike, it seems that a lot of companies subscribe to the one-size-fits-all mentality of investing. Does one size really fit all?
Not with us. Every portfolio that we manage is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. We place our client's interests first in all portfolio decisions.
If you're looking for a home for your seven-figure plus investment portfolio, call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts, specializing in creating and maintaining wealth for over 20 years. 206-903-1019. That's 206-903-1019. Or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Values.com.
About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I want to thank Adam Phillip, who was on our program. He was referred by the Entrepreneurial Organization, the EO, and they were on the program a couple weeks ago. It's a very, very strong organization which brings a lot of activities for entrepreneurs. If you're an entrepreneur, you should consider doing it. So, enough said. Two of the scariest books that I've ever read in my life. One was The Hot Zone by Richard Preston, written in 1994. It was about the Ebola virus, the hantavirus, and, talking about the Ebola virus, and people that got the Ebola virus would bleed out in 2 weeks. I mean, their internal organs would simply melt and they would bleed out through all orifices because everything inside would just come apart. And we just experienced an outbreak of the Ebola virus. But there's other viruses along with the hantavirus. And of course, the fear is that it becomes airborne. And so somebody with the Ebola virus gets on an airplane, flies somewhere, and they infect everybody in the airplane, everybody in the airport. That was the hot zone. And it didn't quite roll that way when we had the Ebola virus, but you can imagine the concepts or the concern that went on by the CDC and other organizations worldwide. That was The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. In fact, Stephen King called the book, it was the scariest book he'd ever read. But the other one that was scary to me was a book called Too Big to Fail. The inside story of how Wall Street and Washington fought to save the financial system from failure in themselves by Andrew Ross Sorkin. It was written in 2009, and it told the story, the inside story, of realizing what went on in 2008, 2009. Scary book, because you began to realize an almost type of virus, just like the Ebola virus, where things began to bleed out from the inside and there was no way to stop it. It was a very terrifying book. Add to that Geithner's book called The Stress Test. Add to that another book, which was probably the best book on the entire panic, a book written by Gary Gordon called Slapped by the Invisible Hand, The Panic of 2007. Now, the invisible hand is a synonym for the economy. Slapped by the economy, the panic of 2007. And I think that it puts into context what happened in 2007, 2008, why we had the Great Recession that we had. It's not something that had not been experienced before. We experienced those kind of depressions and recessions in the 1830s, in the 1840s, 1874, 1930s, and again, 2007, 2008. Now, what happened? Prior to the 1940s and this whole time period, the 70 years from 1930 to 2007, prior to that time, what normally happened with banks is if you had a recession taking place, if you had banks that were in trouble, you would have a run on the bank. You would have a bank panic. You would have a panic where people wanted to withdraw their money. Now, if you deposit $100 or $1,000 into a bank, that goes into your checking account or into your savings account, and the bank has to maintain a reserve. They'll keep maybe $10 out of 100 or 5 out of 100. 5 or 10% has to be kept as a reserve according to the Federal Reserve guidelines. But the rest of the money they'll loan out to somebody, so it becomes illiquid until it's repaid. And banks will loan out 90 or 95% of the money that's taken in into loans, so it becomes very illiquid. Now, if a bank begins to fail, prior to the 1930s, if a bank was beginning to fail, and if it was a single bank, they would borrow money from other banks to cash out the depositors. But if you had multiple banks, you had a bank panic, and that bank panic would shut down the financial system. That happened in the 1830s. And in the 1830s and 1840s, it was the Bank of England and the Bank of France that stepped in and did what the Federal Reserve and the Treasury did in 2007, 2008. In fact, we had a panic in 1796, and it was the Bank of England that bailed us out. In 1874, the arguments were made, the same arguments that we heard in 2007, 2008, just let the system fail, let the survival of the fittest. And we had a period of time of 30 years like 2008. It was good in some respects because we converted from an agricultural society to an industrial society, but it was a very, very difficult time. Unemployment, we didn't record the numbers, but probably 20% unemployment for almost 30 years. Think about it. We had 10% for a couple years. Think about what 20% for 25 or 30 years would be like. It was a very difficult time. People moved into the cities. People started businesses. That became positive. But it was a bank panic. But something happened in the 1930s. A very controversial bill was passed called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. And that guaranteed depositors up to $100,000. So individuals didn't have to worry about their money as long as it was under $100,000. They didn't run the banks. And so we had this period of time in which many economists believed would solve the issue of bank panics. They were a thing of the past. We were not going to experience it. It's a period of time in which economists now call the quiet period, because we didn't experience a bank panic. Now, a panic is not a good word to use, and so we come up with systemic risk, a systemic problem. But it's really a bank failure. And that's what we saw in 2007 and 8. We didn't see individuals running the banks. We didn't see the bank panic from individuals. But what we did see is something that was almost invisible. Because beginning in the 1970s, we began to see a shadow banking system, and probably before that was the nascence of it. But in the 1970s, we began to really see a shadow banking system grow up with endowment funds, with hedge funds, with institutions, with a lot of non-individuals having big, large amounts of cash. We're not talking about 100,000. We're talking about 100 million or 200 or 400 million. And what happened is when Lehman Brothers went down, there was a panic because people were afraid they wouldn't get their money. Now, in order for that to happen, you have to have a huge expansion of credit. You have to have individuals overextended. You have to have companies overextended, governments overextended. Everybody has to have a lot of credit out there. The housing was one factor of that. And when the subprime started, it was like the dominoes, one after another fell. We don't have that today. We have deleveraging. Companies have deleveraged. We have governments who've deleveraged. We have individuals who've deleveraged. So we haven't built up this huge mass amount of credit. That's why no 2008, at least for the next few years. I think this all portends, not that we aren't going to have corrections, not that we're not going to have setbacks in the market, but we're living in a time of a secular bull market, which is probably the best bull market of our lifetime. But it will come to an end. But we have years to go, in my opinion. Anyway, that wraps that up. Have a very good weekend, a very long weekend. A happy Memorial Day. And I'll be back with you next Friday.
You've been listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you want Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared on the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Friday afternoon at 3 for more About Money with Mike Adams, here on Money Radio 1300 KKOL.
The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Creating and maintaining wealth has been the specialty of Adams Financial Concepts for over 20 years. Every portfolio managed by Adams Financial Concepts is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. The client's interest always comes first in portfolio decisions. Call Mike Adams today at 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com to check out their AFC performance. They welcome your review. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com.